Thank you very much. And just for the record, my father is from about 2 hours south of Chicago, and the Giants weren't in San Francisco yet when I committed to the Cubs, which tells you how long ago it is. What I wanted to do today in sort of kicking this off is sort of frame the water side of the equation, because that's the underlying reason that you're here. And let me just say, one of the things I love about Santa Cruz County is that this many people would come out at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning on a rainy day to talk about water and land use. That is a good thing. It just shows we really care about our community. And I think the backdrop for a lot of this also is our changing climate. And coming off of 8 years as Secretary of Resources, there's this so-called debate about whether climate change is happening. And I moved around the state. Lake Tahoe is heating faster than any freshwater alpine lake in the world. Our fire season, I almost don't need to talk about, but over a generation ago, it starts a month earlier, it starts a month later. The most significant fires in California history, the top 10, almost all of them have been since 2000, where there's less humidity. There's extreme fire behavior that just hasn't existed, such as the fire tornado that existed in Redding. The sea levels have risen 7 inches in the last 100 years, scheduled to go to 14 inches. And we had the most major drought in modern times in the early part of this decade. And it really led to, East Porterville was out of water for almost 2 years in Tulare County. I visited Willits, where it took a 5-mile pipe to back up their system and keep them from going dry. And right here, the state funded a 4-mile pipe from Lompico over into the San Lorenzo Valley Water District to back that up in the event of that system going dry. So that was happening all over, and I have a sneaking suspicion that is the tip of the iceberg for the next few decades. So the question is how do we use this time we have to make sure we get to a sustainable water system? And if you look at this area in the 1970s, water districts were suing each other. There were fights. There was a time when the Soquel Creek Water District asked the city of Santa Cruz for an intertie, for emergency intertie. Santa Cruz said no. Then after the storm of 82, January 4th of 1982, east side of Santa Cruz was on the verge of going dry. Dominican Hospital was on the verge of going dry. Santa Cruz turns and has to ask Soquel Creek for an emergency intertie, and they very graciously say yes, which I'm sure was hard for them given the history. And then if you move into the 1980s, I was elected to the Santa Cruz City Council in 1981, and right away we were having meetings of every land use and water supply significant agency in the county around a horseshoe in the Civic Auditorium. We entered into a region-wide JPA, Joint Powers Agreement, region-wide study that inventoried water demand at build-out of every general plan and inventoried water sources that existed locally to try to match them up, that we were actually planning for what we were expecting for growth. It made peace. At least 2 of the agencies came in as settlements of lawsuits and not initially of their own volition, but it meant that people were talking to each other and working together. And the flaw in that process is that peace was made, the facts were on the table for the first time in a major way, but nobody could quite pull the trigger. John Ricker is here, and he pointed out to me, he reminded me what happened then was all great process, but nobody could pull the trigger on an actual water project coming out of that. And so then you fast forward, and in 2002, the Proposition 50 was passed, water bond, and it created integrated regional watershed management areas and the ability to have state grant funds to regions. And I had just been elected to the assembly, and I worked with some of the people in this room to say it will not work if there's 50 individual water applications that all compete against each other from the county. The thing that will work is if you all work together and unify and present some sort of uh, mutually agreed upon application that includes everyone. And that's what happened. And it ended up being a model. Monterey followed, other places in the state followed, and there was once again some sort of agreement. Then you move into this decade, and we have the drought. First time there were mandatory water restrictions on the statewide level coming out of the drought. And it really changed what you could do. Now, Chris just talked about a little bit about how the Groundwater Management Act was created, but let me talk a little about the politics and the background at the statewide level. Because I used to say, and many of you heard me say this, we were the last state among the Western states to regulate groundwater, to have some sort of scheme that would try to get to sustainability in groundwater. And as I always say, and somebody cribbed from me on the assembly floor, when Texas is ahead of us on an environmental issue, we should scratch our heads. They protected groundwater, California didn't. And the thing that happened in the drought that really forced the issue to the fore is there was just significant overdrafting in certain parts of the state. If you look at the satellite aerial maps of the San Joaquin Valley, it was dramatic over the life of the drought, how significantly it was overdrafted, and it led to subsidence where the ground collapsed, in some places in the tens of feet over time. And it's not something that you inject water in and it comes back. It's like when it moves, it is essentially done. And it had a significant infrastructure effect. There are pictures of bridges across canals where the bridge was at equal footing on each side, and now it tilts to one way. It affected, ironically, the very canals that bring water into the Central Valley. Some of them were losing capacity because of the sinking underneath the canals, and we were worried and have done a lot of work on the impact to the state aqueduct and the fact that it threatened that. And there's a whole nother story, but I had some very interesting meetings, some with the governor and some not, with former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. And in one of the meetings, they asked us to essentially waive California environmental laws to allow the federal government to move federal water through state canals because the federal canals were at significantly lower capacity because of the groundwater overdrafting in the San Joaquin Valley. And so this created the opportunity for the Groundwater Management Act. And while I highlight that, the valley, certain coastal areas are really struggling. Seawater intrusion exists. The Pajaro Valley has been the poster child over time, but the Salinas Valley is not exempt. When I was on AMBAG and the board in the 1980s, seawater had intruded toward the first Salinas city municipal well. And so overdrafting of the groundwater basins has been significant. And what this bill basically does, while it was dates that were farther out than some of us would have supported at the time to get the votes, it was really by 2040, the most stressed basins have to be in balance. And as Chris said, there's a whole process. And part of the problem is that in many places, the existing political boundaries for water agencies don't overlap exactly with what the groundwater basins are. So how do you create joint powers agreements that cover the whole basin and represent fairly the people from the different agencies that overlap with them? And our job from the state level, Lois, who is always very shy about expressing her opinions, did tell me beforehand that she thinks one of the big issues overall is the state needs to step in at some point and pay for the process more because it's stressing local jurisdictions. I think that's something that needs to be looked at over time. And a lot of it came when we were still in the economic downturn and the budget crunch was still existing. And when we could get money, we put it into technical assistance to try to help the districts work through this. Well, they have met the deadlines to date. The next significant deadline is in 2020 with regard to sort of the plan for sustainability. They appointed someone to my position yesterday, Governor Newsom did. I knew he was coming for a week. I've had a series of meetings with him already to bring him up to speed. He is really aware of the deadlines in the Groundwater Management Act and what needs to be done going forward. And so we also issued in 2013, 2014, a water action plan where we really, the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of EPA, and myself, with us taking the lead, said, here's what we have to do to get to sustainable water in California. And it included conservation as a way of life, some more storage, managing our groundwater basins, water recycling, better conjunctive use between districts, modernizing systems so there's not loss in the system. It's something that's online. It's only 20 pages. It's actually understandable. It's not like a lengthy environmental document. And we have issued reports on our progress against it. And the water bond in 2014 was designed to match the pots. The pots were designed to match the different goals that were in the water action plan. And for the first time, there were not carve outs or earmarks. It was basically, you have to demonstrate that you can produce water in these areas to be able to get the grants. And the recycling money's out the door. The storage money's almost out the door. A lot of the other is in process or out the door, trying to assist locals in doing that. And so that is the backdrop on the water side for what you're all going to talk about today. And I feel obligated, since I just talked entirely about water and growth is a piece of the subject matter in land use, that the important thing for me in this is to never get away from the fact that we have to have a sustainable water basin here. And so I worked with some of the hydrologists, and it was always in English, define for me what is a sustainable basin? How do you measure? And it was basically, it just got down to, in English, you can't take out of a basin over time more than you put into it. And you have to, over time, up to the 2040, put into it enough that it's at a manageable level, and then you can deal with that sustainably. So that's what you have to do. And as somebody that is a veteran of the growth fights that exist in Santa Cruz County, that is very important, extremely important, whether it's the growth management, whether it's having a measure of affordability in housing. But now, I think with fire as an overlay, you really have to look at where we're putting people and where they're in danger and how you best protect against them in the growth. And you have to know that you are going to have a sustainable water source. So number one, I think, is while all of you probably have disagreements among you on growth, the bottom line is we have to get to a sustainable basin. The basin has to be sustainable, and the growth decisions have to come from that. It's if the basin is sustainable and you know what the yield is in normal years, that's what you plan for, and then have the growth discussion. But I worry because we didn't have the urgency in the 1980s process to get to the end, to force us to make decisions. The Sigma process forces us to make decisions. And so we should not get off the track by the growth issues. The growth issues are valid and need to be debated, but we need to be there and make sure that it's totally in balance. And so as you head into this, that's the challenge. And I think that we're going to have um, significant drought going forward. And the other issue is that we've been so successful in California and in places that you wouldn't think. Your cliches or stereotypes. I mean, since roughly 1990, uh, Southern California, south of the Tehachapis, has grown by almost 5 million people on less water than they were using in 1990. And so that is really significant. The growth has been accommodated by more efficiency in water supply delivery. But the flip side of that is that you have less places to go in droughts. You have less places where there's flex in the system for people to make reductions. And so it means that when you do good conservation like that, you have to have reliability in the system to know that when you have a drought, you're going to get through. And this is not an abstract principle. If any of you have read about Australia in the last decade, there was a time their drought went almost a decade, almost a full decade. And if ours in California had gone that past more than 4 or 5 years, there would have been catastrophic impacts. And in Australia, they were 90 days from the metropolitan area of Melbourne, which has 5 million people. They were 90 days from the entire system going dry. And they were trying to figure out what they would do in that eventuality. And so this is not an abstract thing. If we head back into a significant drought, it goes a couple of years longer than the last one, we're going to have some real problems. And we have to have some reliability in the system. And San Diego really prides itself on the fact that it has diversified its system, but it includes conservation, water recycling, things that are not underlying sources of supply. And you need something that is a stable underlying source of supply in those times to make it work. So I just wish you well. I'm so glad there's so many people here that are willing to talk about this and consider these impacts because our future really depends on it. And I look forward to finding ways to work with you in this. But we have to get to a sustainable Santa Margarita aquifer. We just have to get there. And then the question is what comes from all those decisions. So good luck, and I'm really glad everybody's participating in this. Good luck for a successful day.
So we started late. I apologize about that. But we probably have a couple minutes for Q&A. Like I said, if we've got comment cards and question cards, what I'll do right now is I'm going to go ahead and just run a mic around really fast. But we're going to have to move fast. I'm going to have to cut it off so we can kind of catch up some time. So let me grab another mic. Does anybody have? Pardon me. Does anybody have immediate questions they'd like to ask John? Like I said, I can't take a ton. We got to get ourselves a little bit back on time. We'll go to this gentleman here, and then we'll see where we're at.
Assuming there's a long-term drought coming due to climate change, how are you going to determine what is sustainable? Because 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it could be completely different, and we don't have the slightest idea what's going to happen.
Well, we do have the slightest idea on what usage patterns are and who is that. And the tough decision, and it was the decision we were facing in the drought, is we would have had enough water for 6 or 7 years if we lowered to certain patterns. And yet people didn't want to lower to certain patterns if they thought the drought was going to be over in the next year. And you're gambling against what you don't know. And that is the hardest thing about this. And so we advise people to be conservative, to act as if it was going to be a 6 or 7 year drought and figure out with existing supplies how you would get through that. If it turned out to be 4 to 5, if it had turned out to be 9 or 10, we'd have had a whole different thing. And so it is trying to, without knowing what's coming, make the appropriate decision to best protect the limited supplies that you have.
Hi, how do we deal with historical water rights in this new environmental drought paradigm that we have, and not just for people, but for the environmental uses as well, to make sure that species like fish and other wildlife get the water that they need?
Oh, you opened up Pandora's box, but it's fine. Because the water rights is a tough issue. And one of the interesting things is I represented the governor for 8 years at Western Governors, and I would talk to governors or gubernatorial staffers from other states, and it was like breathtaking. I think it was New Mexico that they just have equal water rights. Everybody's in it equally, no year cutoff if you had senior rights, junior. And so when they were going into a drought, everybody was in it because everybody was affected equally. And in Australia, they chose to switch their water rights system in the middle of their drought. And what they did, and they were lucky, it was before the economic meltdown by a few years, and they had a different economy of scale, and they were able to spend, and I can't remember the number, $6 or $8 billion, and buy out some of the senior water rights, and then allocate water rights for the environment, for municipal uses, for agriculture in a way that there was somewhat more equal water rights. And I think if the drought had gone on a couple of years here, you know, I was asked, I think it was on NPR, and I was being followed by the chair of the water board about water rights. And I said, in California, it's a thermonuclear issue. And she thanked me because she said it just took away the first 2 minutes she was going to have to explain away the thing. But if the governor was starting to make noises in the 4th year of the drought, that if this continued, we would have to look at that. And for the uninitiated, there was major water rights law passed in 1914. And so California water rights are divided between pre-1914, which are known as senior water rights, post-1914, which are known as junior water rights, and then water rights have been added in previous years much more for habitat and the environment that existed before. I mean, I know Toby and Rosemary are here from Santa Cruz. It's when I was on the city council, my solution for additional water was to raise the dam at Loch Lomond by 5 feet, because you own the distribution system, you own the watershed. You could have exponential more water without having to invest a lot, just although it's a significant cost in redoing the dam. But Santa Cruz was not subject to inflow requirements for fish at the time, and it would have kicked them in, and then there would have been less water after doing that project for municipal supply than there was before. Now those in-stream use requirements have kicked in, and so Santa Cruz is having to go through a process that balances this groundwater, the surface water for fish, and the fact that there's been major conservation over years without additional sources of supply. How do they balance that? And it's a process with people in rooms exactly like they're in this room, trying to have that debate. And I think that if this continues the way it is, I don't see how we don't look at water rights over time. That is still a thermonuclear issue. Any time is the time to do it, if you can figure out politically how to get it done.
Okay. How do I ask John Laird to pass on to somebody else? I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. I'll do it.
4 days ago, he was the Secretary of Resources. So give him thank you. Tom is heading up. As Tom is heading up, let me go ahead and I went through all the comment cards. Thank you. Really great response on even the first question cards. I tried to group them in a couple of kind of common themes. I'm going to read them as fast as I can here. And again, these are sort of the pretty key themes. So, and these are not in any particular order, but just to try to give you all equal representation. So definitely a key theme that came up was growth, not surprisingly. Some of the things it said right out of the blocks: stop Scotts Valley growth. Oh, there we go. I just, we're done now. You can just go. How can our depleted water basin support projected population growth? Will there be water sharing agreements with the city of Santa Cruz? Why or why not? How is Scotts Valley able to grow with water crisis? Do they have a plan to use SLV water after we've made a conscious effort to not grow to preserve our water? So there's been definitely some thematics. And again, this is just representative. There was another number of questions or comments about just general understanding, knowledge, path for information. We want to look to be collaborative. Want a fact-based understanding of the drivers of water demand in both urban and semi-rural settings. Ways to conserve water and to recharge the aquifers. A deeper understanding of public education and the workshops and how that's going to be handled. An additional card also talked about a better understanding about just our water conditions, ecological conditions, water quality. So these came up. Not all of those kinds of topics are going to get covered today. They are going to be getting covered in the subsequent. So today we're focusing principally on land use growth and the interaction between that and water use. But some of these other questions about just how the basin works, these are in the subsequent workshops, which is why these are lengthy, half-day workshops. Small water users. A number of cards came in about learn how to protect how the small well water users' water rights are going to be protected and how that's going to be protected from those who will profit from growth. So there were a couple of cards on that. And I don't think actually when Chris was up there, I'm not sure if I just sort of distracted, but when you were talking about the board, did you mention that there's 2 private well members? I just, okay, for the record, Chris said it was a mistake, not me. But to their credit, this agency, and this did not happen in a number of places around the state, this agency very proactively made sure that even though the legislation didn't really set it up effectively, that private water users really could be parts of agencies, they were allowed a latitude if they wanted to. This agency stepped right forward and did that. And there are 120 some odd of these agencies around the state, or more than that, and many did not do that. This one did. So I think they should be applauded for that. Agency coordination, insight to the agency's commitment to equity and accountability in basin resources. Why is there such a disconnect in this county between land use, the planning department's permitting, and water, and how can we fix that problem? We are going to talk about that. I know that today. I'd like to be confident that all the various agencies can really work together and find solutions. And then lastly, there were a number of cards just about regulation, wanting to learn more about the regulation. How is it, the regulation writ large is the law, and then how is groundwater going to be regulated in this basin? And I think it's fair to say that that's coming. That's what this agency is going to be working on for the next 2 years. That's what you need to be actively involved, because they're going to be building these tools in place of how it's going to be regulated. So that's a starter place. And I very specifically am hoping that the presenters, their later presenters and panelists will listen closely. So if there's some things you need to focus on, I just gave you some pointers.